Good
Yes.
evening, everyone. I hope everyone is doing well. In Bangalore, we are currently enjoying rains. I hope wherever you are safe and healthy. So, I welcome you all for the two-day online workshop, namely Faces of AI. This workshop has been organized by NIA CSP, and this was an initiative taken by Dr. Nitin Nagraj under the guidance of Professor Sangeeta Menon. And I request everyone to please mute themselves because it'll be, we would avoid unnecessary noise while the lecture and the discussion is going on. For the discussion, I can request everyone, if they want to ask any question, they can put it in the chat box and not speak up in the between. So it'll be easier for the speaker to respond in a systematic manner. And also, if possible, we can all switch on our videos so that it can be an interactive session. And it's a humble request, please put in your full name when you log in via Zoom, because it is easier for our team to know who has logged in and we can note down your attendance. So these are just some disclaimers before we start the workshop. Sorry about that. And before we begin with the first lecture of today, I humbly request the head and dean, NIA CSP, School of Humanities, Professor Sangeeta Menon, to say a few words.
Yeah, namaste all of you, and thank you, Niharika, for inaugurating, I should say, perhaps starting this wonderful program. And I also thank Professor Nitin Nagaraj for initiating this program. In our team, we have been interested in AI for quite some time, and Professor Nitin, me, and others always engaged with the various aspects of AI, perhaps not just only the technical AI aspects of AI, but also the social, psychological, philosophical aspects, perhaps in brief to say the humanities aspect of AI. And so Professor Nitin Nagaraj has been brilliantly doing a lot of work in many areas related to AI and information theory. It's really something great that he has put up this workshop together with some exemplary people, and one of them is Professor Tilak Agarwala. And namaste to you, Professor Tilak. It's indeed our fortune that we get to listen to Professor Tilak Agarwala, who has a very extensive background and expertise in this area. And I should say a word that indeed I'm surprised, and I'm very happy to see Dr. Robert Karachi in this view. I don't know how many people in this audience know him, but perhaps you have a minute, just Google his name and you will see why I'm specially mentioning his name. So thank you, Robert, for being there. And it's really indeed an honor for us that you are attending this workshop, and it will be a great pleasure. So, so I think this is a two-day workshop, and indeed it will be a great experience for all of us to listen to all the other expert speakers like Professor Snehanshu Saha and Professor Ellam Patnaik. And our idea is to raise more questions and to perhaps think originally on this topic, which is indeed going to hold us for perhaps many, many years to come. Thank you, Niharika.
Thank you, ma'am. Now we can start with our first lecture. Before the lecture, it's an honor to introduce Dr. Nitin Nagraj today. So informally, I've known sir for 2 years now, and he has been like a guiding force for me along with Sangeeta ma'am. So apart from the informal introduction, I'll just say a few words. Dr. Nitin Nagraj is an associate professor currently with NIA CSP. He has a bachelor's in electric and electronic engineering from National Institute of Technology, Karnataka. He has his master's in electrical engineering for RIP, Troy, New York, and his PhD from NIAS. During his 5 years in the industry, he was a co-inventor of 8 US patent applications. He has a list of publications along with 10 years of experience in academic circle, and he's a great teacher that I know of, and I humbly request sir to say a few words about this workshop and also to begin with this lecture. So over to you.
Thank you, Niharika, for that generous introduction. Namaste to everyone, and a warm welcome to all of you. I joined Professor Sangeeta in hoping and praying that you're all safe, healthy, and in positive spirits wherever you are. and thank you for joining to the workshop. So let me share my screen and then I'll begin the lecture. Okay, yeah, so as Prasad Sangeeta said, the workshop is trying to look at different facets of AI and not just limited to the technological side dimension alone, but we are also interested in the philosophical, ethical, and societal implications of AI. So that's the reason that we have picked topics and speakers who try to look at these various aspects. So today we have two lectures, mine followed by Professor Tilak Agarwala's talk subsequently. And tomorrow we have two more lectures. So I request you all to, wait for the questions. You could wait till the end of the talk. The talk will be for 45 minutes. And then there'll be a discussion for 30 minutes. So we at NIAS believe that it's very important to have different opinions, ideas, suggestions, and discussions with the speaker and the audience. And that's the reason we want to have a long time for the discussion time. So you could type in the questions in the chat, and then we could take it up. So let's begin. Yeah, so let me just begin. Yeah, so just give me a minute. Okay, yeah, so the topic that I want to start off today is try to give you a flavor of AI looked at a particular lens, and I'm titling it as From Turing to Sophia, and you will see why I have named it this way. So let's begin this journey. Now let me ask you this question here. If I give you this photograph here, right, and ask you the question, can it think? Now you might wonder, can this particular box here, can it really think? You may have doubts. Okay, then I'm going to add in a few more elements to this particular picture here. Okay, and what about now? Can you think it can think? And we could also ask the same question to other aspects like the phone, the smartphone, the internet. Of course, we say that the phone is a smartphone, so potentially it could think, right? But none of us really believe that it can think, right? What about these? What about these? And what about these here? On the left side, you will see a mannequin. And on the right side, you see a ventriloquist with a ventriloquist dummy here. What about these? Again, I'm pretty sure that most of us here, pretty much all of us here will probably say that both of these things do not think. Now, what about this picture here? I hope many of you can recognize this particular robot here. It's actually a humanoid robot called Sophia. Now, Sophia was actually invented by a Hong Kong-based company called Hanson Robotics in 2016. And it uses speech recognition technology from Alphabet, the company that is the father of the parent company of Google. And it's actually a social robot in the sense that the idea is that it will interact with the elderly people and with other people, who need companionship. And interestingly, in 2017, Sophia was given Saudi Arabian citizenship. So somewhere I think we might believe or tend to believe that Sophia could probably think, maybe, right? That's a possibility. What about these here? What about these? If Sophia could think, possibly, what about these kind of these animals here? We know, for example, that animals are very intelligent, right? Because, for example, in the 2004 tsunami, none of the animals were actually injured, right? They were all clever enough to know that there is an oncoming tsunami coming in. And you know that there are dogs which can smell cancer. There are dogs which can smell cancer, for example. There are chimpanzees which have much better short-term memory than humans. So all these animals, each one of them, we could actually give examples which demonstrate some level of intelligence and sometimes exceeding the capability of humans as well. Now, the question we can also ask is, okay, what about a collective? Could a collective be intelligent, right? That's also we can ask this question. And there are several amazing examples again in the animal world, and even in the bacterial world, actually. There's something known as quorum sensing, which is about bacteria communicating with each other. Of course, we know about ant colonies and bees performing these complicated dance that they do. And then there is, of course, the what is called the bubble net feeding by humpback whales. So this was actually found in Southeast Alaska, where these whales, right? And it's a learned characteristic. It's not something which is passed on instinctively. It is actually learned, and they form a very complicated bubble net. They synchronize their the forming of bubbles, and they feed fishes, and this is actually learned and passed on like from a teacher to a student kind of a thing. It's passed on from generation to generation. So, I mean, and of course, so these are amazing things, you know, and who are we to say that they're not intelligent, right? So we can ask this question. Now, of course, now you will say that this particular picture here, I'm pretty sure that everybody in the audience will agree that this gentleman here is intelligent, right? There's absolutely no doubt in your mind that Albert Einstein was intelligent, right? I mean, it's obvious. And in fact, if you probably you know this, right? That his brain has been studied after his death, and it was found that the prefrontal cortex of the brain of Einstein had very complicated convolutions, much more complex pattern of convolutions in the prefrontal cortex, which is actually responsible for abstract thinking. That's what they say. So in that sense, you know, his brain was not exactly like the brain of most of us, apparently, and that helped him to do the work that he did. Okay, anyway, so enough of these examples now. Now let's say that we ask the question, what would make the cut? Like what kind of requirement do we say is needed to say that something is intelligent, right? And this is a list which is very, very debatable, very controversial, very debatable. And I'm not saying that this is a perfect list. Probably we would say that it looks like human, like Sophia definitely looks like human. It behaves like a human, acts, thinks, and feels probably. We don't know whether it can feel. It communicates like a human, definitely, right? I mean, we would never call a phone, to be human, right? Because it does communicate, but it does not communicate like a human, right? It should have a brain like a human, possibly. Again, very, very debatable, controversial. I'm not saying that there's actually a list which we have to agree upon. Definitely, I feel that maybe whatever that is that we claim is intelligent should have emotions and feelings, imagination, creativity, humor, possibly. What about values? What about character? What about personality, right? I mean, these are very, very fundamental for saying that somebody is intelligent, right? Because there's not one kind of intelligence, right? There's several dimensions of intelligence as well. What about life goals? Should we say that somebody has a life goal and necessarily that entails intelligence, maybe? And last but not the least, again, very, very difficult to define, but the sense of I or I am. And we'll actually investigate this more in my talk. Okay. So this question, that can machines think, right? This question actually was initiated by this gentleman, Alan Turing, and I'm sure that all of you have heard of his name. So Alan Turing, actually, okay, this particular one that I'm showing here, it was actually in 2019 BBC TV series where they actually had a competition and a voting kind of a competition between different icons of the 20th century. And it turned out that Alan Turing actually was the winner of that particular competition. And because of Alan Turing, we know that World War II actually ended at least 2 years before it was supposed to end because of the breaking of the Enigma, right? We know the story of how we broke this Enigma code, and historians say that 14 million lives were saved. But of course, we know Alan Turing for much more than that, right? Because of all the work he did in theoretical computer science and the notion of a computing machine, the notion of computing itself, for that matter. So now Alan Turing, in a lecture in 1947. He made the following statement. It's actually a verbatim quote. What we want is a machine that can learn from experience. So this is actually the key thing, that can learn from experience. So this is 1947, right? And in fact, this is the first mention of computer intelligence. This particular, we can argue that this is probably the first mention of computer intelligence. And today in 2020, right, this idea is at the heart of all of AI, whether it's neural networks, machine learning, deep learning, robots, all the 3 billion devices that we have, smartphones, internet, all digital devices that you can think of, which is doing any kind of intelligent processing. This is actually the heart of it, that a machine that can learn from experience. That's the notion of computational intelligence. Okay, now you might also know that Turing actually not just worked on computing, but he also worked on, he also did some contributions to biology. That's another interesting fact, if you are not aware of it. Now, anyway, so Alan Turing asked this question in 1950, can machines think? And there's a very famous paper in Mind, in this quarterly review of philosophy and psychology and philosophy. And in this particular paper, he argues that it is very, very difficult to measure thinking, to define thinking. It's very, very difficult to do that. And hence, what he proposes is what is called as an imitation game. Okay, and it's a very, very simple game. And it's a thought experiment. It's a thought experiment, what you call as a Gedanken experiment. Now, this is one thing that you notice of all these great people, right? Whether it's Einstein or Turing, and later we will also talk about other people. They do these amazing thought experiments. It's not necessarily an experiment that you're supposed to do it in reality, but just you can think about it. And what he suggested is very, very simple. He said that, look, there are 3 rooms here. In one of the rooms, there's an interrogator, the person here marked Z here. And in the 2 other rooms, there is a man and a woman. but all the rooms are in such a way that they're all in lockdown, right? And we can understand that in this pandemic situation, everybody's alone here and they can only communicate through a small window, but they cannot see each other. They can only communicate using typed text. That's it, you know. So you can't hear, smell, touch, see, taste, etc., but you could just transmit textual information. And the goal of the interrogator is to figure out who is the man and who is the woman in the two rooms. That's his thing. And the idea here is that one of them, let's say for example, the woman here in this thing, is trying to convince the interrogator that it is she that who's the woman, you know, that, okay. And the man here in this particular game, the idea is that the man is going to confuse the interrogator by trying to pose as a woman, you know. Now the interrogator is obviously confused now, right? Because he's getting these textual messages and it's a dialogue, it's a back and forth dialogue. And at the end of it, he has to figure out, he or she, the interrogator could be anybody, should figure out who is the man and who is the woman. So remember that one of them cooperates with the interrogator and the other one does not cooperate with the interrogator. This is the imitation game. And Turing suggested that, look, let's get rid of the man. I mean, who needs the man, right? Let's get rid of the man. And I would sort of say that's the right thing to do. And keep the woman there and replace the man with a machine. Okay? So keep the replace the man with the machine. Right? So, and now the question is, can the interrogator figure out who is human and who is the machine? Okay. And here again, the human being is going to cooperate, is going to help the interrogator by trying to give answers, trying to say that, look, I am the woman, you know, I'm the man, I'm the human being. But the machine is trying to also do the same thing. The machine is going to try to deceive the interrogator. So this is the what is called the imitation game. But subsequently, this was called as a Turing test in honor of Alan Turing. And this actually is an amazing idea, a thought experiment. And it started a flurry of, you can say, discussion in the AI community. And then people tried to build this. So in 1966, Joseph Weizenbaum built this program called ELIZA. It's actually a natural language processing computer program he built at MIT. And it just does some purely pattern matching and substitution. Okay, and it does not have any kind of understanding whatsoever. It just does some substitution and pattern matching. But it's able to convince many people that that it's actually a human being, you know, and it's a chatbot psychotherapist. Okay, and then there is 1990 onwards, there was this the setup of this Loebner Prize, where the idea is basically it's an annual competition in AI, and this is actually held in recent times in Bletchley Park. So if you recall, Bletchley Park is in England, and that's the place where Alan Turing, along with around 800 other researchers, other people, broke the enigma, right? That's the Bletchley Park. And this is actually conducted in Bletchley Park since 2014 onwards. And it's actually an annual competition where the most human-like programs are given this prize. And of course, the competition is a Turing test. There are rounds of Turing tests, and the judge has to determine whether he or she can correctly guess whether the program is human or not, you know. And the last 5 years, or rather a 5-time winner, 2013 and 2016, 2019, was this a chatbot. It's an 18-year-old female chatbot invented by the programmer Steve Warswick. It's called as Mitsuku. Actually, you can Mitsuku, and you can actually go to the website, you know, and check it out. It's actually very, very convincing. And this is actually won the last 4 years consecutively. Okay, and it is an amazing sort of. It can fool anyone. It's pretty good actually. So I just want to show you that people have tried to build these things. Okay. Now, of course, Turing test is also very popular in movies. I'm sure that you all know of the imitation game, many of you. And there's another movie in 2014, which is probably not very popular. I'm not sure that it's that popular. It's called Ex Machina, where it's the movie about the Turing test. Actually, there is this programmer invited to conduct the Turing test on a robot by this entrepreneur in a remote location. No, he's sort of in some forest, and you know, it's a very interesting premise, I think. Yeah, so I thought I should mention that. Okay, now what is very, very interesting is that every one of you here who is listening to this lecture here has actually taken a Turing test. Okay, and it's just that you may not be familiar with, you may not be aware that you have taken a Turing test, but every one of you have taken it. That's my claim. And this is exactly what the Turing test is, right? We call it as CAPTCHA. I'm sure every one of you have done this, right? You have to go, if you're probably booking a ticket on IRCTC, or you're doing some online transaction, or you're trying to register somewhere, they have this CAPTCHA, and the idea is to not allow for you know, spam to, you know, I mean, like a robot to be able to pass these tests, right? So that's actually called a CAPTCHA. There's actually a Turing test. In fact, CAPTCHA stands for that, CAPTCHA basically stands for completely automated public Turing test to tell computers and humans apart. Very interesting, isn't it? I mean, so we all know the word CAPTCHA, but probably very few of us probably know that it's actually Turing test, because it says Turing test in the acronym itself, And this was actually invented, I think, around 1997, and 2003 is when it was, I think, more popularized in the way that we see it today by researchers in Carnegie Mellon. And there's been some dispute as to who really invented it, but anyway, we'll not get into that. Now, what is very important to remember is that the CAPTCHA really works because that there are certain things which human beings can do very easily. For example, when you do a CAPTCHA, they might ask you, right, what is 34 plus 71? I mean, something like that, right? But then that computation is done, it's like an image with some noise embedded in it. So, I mean, of course, the computer can do the computation very quickly, but the computation cannot even recognize that it's actually a math problem, right? I mean, it may not be even able to recognize in the first place. Or that could be trying to recognize some speech, a piece of a word or something like that, So the idea is that it's easy for humans, but nearly impossible for computers to do. That's the notion of the CAPTCHA. So it's entirely a Turing. So Turing's idea is actually being used today, every day, Okay, now there are several strengths of the Turing test, several strengths of them, very briefly. It's actually very cool, right? It's very easy to play. It's very, very simple, very tractable. It avoids very tough philosophical questions like what is thinking, what is it just bypasses that, right? That's the strength of it. It could also be the weakness of it, you can say. It's very easy to administer it. More or less, it's very, very easy to administer it. There's no verbal human interaction. It's just, as I said earlier, right, that all the three participants are in lockdown mode, and it's just about textual interface. You can ask wide variety of questions, right? It's not just limited to a technical field. It could be natural language skills, conversational skills, etc. One could also argue that you can test for aesthetic and emotional intelligence as well using the Turing test. In some sense, you can say that the Turing test is just very, very visionary, right? Because the idea is to push towards a more friendly AI that has empathy and can relate to our feelings. I mean, that's one way to look at it. But there's several weaknesses as well. It's not that people have criticized the Turing test quite vigorously. One can argue that it does not really test intelligence whatsoever, That's the claim. It only tests whether a machine can mimic human behavior. So that means that there could be deception, there could be mimicry or deception. So it's not really that it's important that it's intelligent, but it's about deception. And it's also not about external appearances, but it's about external appearance and not about internal processes. Like, how do you actually get the answer? And later we will actually see that this particular thing is also there's a very nice argument using this particular idea. It's called the Chinese room argument. We will actually look at that. And what about non-human intelligence, right? That is completely rejected by this possibility, right? Deception, mimicry, I already mentioned that. And remember that the Turing test depends entirely on conversational skills and human identification abilities of interrogators. So what if the interrogator or the judge is not good enough to actually determine that, right? So, and Turing did not really specify the criteria for choosing the interrogator. What should be the criteria that an interrogator should pass in order to be the judge for the interrogator for the Turing test? There are several other limitations and objections. There's this paper in 1990 by Robert French. You could take a look at it. And there's this discussion between simulated intelligence and true intelligence. That it's not really measuring true intelligence, but a simulation of intelligence. That's an argument too. And the Turing test is too demanding in some sense, right? What we're asking for the robot or the machine to do is to try to sort of give a sort of a culturally oriented notion of human intelligence, right? It has to pass off saying that, I'm human because it can talk like human beings. It can make jokes. It can have slang words, whatever, humor, contextual humor and stuff like that. So it's culturally oriented human, but that's actually in some sense good. I mean, people can argue both ways, The point here is that the Turing test could be passed by things that have experienced the world as we have experienced it. Definitely, probably it's a good thing, right? I mean, I don't know whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. So we would, or one can argue that it's too demanding, that we are asking something to have experienced the world the way we experience it. That's too much to ask for, one can argue. Okay, this is the famous, I think one of the most famous arguments you can say is this Chinese room argument. It's a very simple argument. Again, it's a thought experiment. It's a Gedanken experiment. The power of thought experiments is amazing, right? So maybe we can argue that, can an AI do a thought experiment, right? I mean, that could be one test, Anyway, so I'll just mention what the thought experiment is. So this goes back to John Searle, professor in UC Berkeley. And in 1980, he made this very beautiful, very simple argument, but very, very profound argument. He said, look, imagine the following situation, okay? There is this room wherein there's a person inside the room who has no idea of Chinese, okay? He does not know Chinese whatsoever. He or she, could be anybody, but this person does not know Chinese, but there's a Chinese dictionary or a book or whatever you can say, which tries to map, giving a mapping from Chinese words to Chinese words, you know? Okay, and there are two holes in the room. There's an inlet and an outlet. In the inlet, the person enters a question in Chinese. Okay, a question or a conversation or a sentence. And what the person inside the Chinese room does is it takes the sheet of paper which has Chinese in it. Remember, the person has no idea what Chinese is. He looks at the dictionary. He looks at these symbols, Chinese symbols. He has no idea what it means. He matches it with the book and looks at what has to be done. So think of the book like a recipe. The book is like a program. It's giving you, if this is the input string in Chinese, this is the output string. He writes it up and then gives it in the output. Now, a person outside the room who's having this particular game, right? He's giving in Chinese and receiving Chinese answers. If it's properly done, the person outside the room will imagine, oh, there's a very, very intelligent Chinese person inside the room. You know, that's what he will think. So, in other words, we have effectively fooled the person in sort of believing that somebody's inside the room who knows Chinese. But if you look at the room, there's no aspect in the room where there is Chinese. Nobody knows Chinese there, right? There's a book, there is there could be a very complicated book, and there's this person who has no idea about Chinese. So this is the Chinese room argument. So the point here is that following instance, like how the Chinese person is doing inside the room, is not equal to understanding, right? He's just following the rules. It's very mechanical. It's just mechanical. So the argument that John Searle is giving is that there's no understanding, there's no understanding. And one can argue that there is some intentionality in understanding, right? This notion of understanding is necessary to qualify for intelligence. And the Chinese room argument shows that you can mimic or simulate intelligence, but you cannot, there may be nothing inside which is understanding that particular thing, So understanding, we know, I think this is probably less debatable or less controversial, that understanding is a conscious experience. I think many of you probably will agree to that, right? When you understand something, oh, aha, you'll say eureka moment, right? Oh, I understood this. You understand a joke, you understand a theorem, you understand music, whatever, there is an aha moment, and that is an experience. It's a conscious experience. And it seems to me that, and it's not just to me, I mean, famous philosophers like David Chalmers has argued that the Chinese room argument is all about consciousness, actually. At the end of the day, what we're actually basically saying is that you need this conscious experience of understanding. And without that, there can't be any intelligence. Okay, now remember, Turing was very, very smart. Turing actually knew this already, and he actually made this argument himself in his paper. In fact, in his paper, he gives a whole bunch of arguments against the Turing test, objections, you can say, very much like the Purva Paksha kind of a framework. So what Turing is saying is that, look, these are the possible objections, and I'll try to answer them. And one of the argument is the argument from consciousness, and he sort of summarizes it in this particular way that this is actually to Jefferson Lister, who says that we would want the machine not only to write or to sort of mechanically do certain things, but it should know that it has written it. It should know that it has done something. It should feel, so it should have the pleasure of its successes. It should be sorrow when its valves fuse. It should be warmed by flattery and stuff like that. So basically what Lister is saying here is that, look, we don't want the machine to just mechanically give me the answer or converse with me, but it should feel that and it should know that it's doing it. That's the point that Lister is saying. So Turing knew this, and Turing actually replied back saying, we can't be certain that other people think or feel. It is only a polite convention to assume it. Why not extend the same courtesy to machines if they show evidence of their feelings? So basically what Turing is saying is that, look, this argument can be also made to other people as well, right? I mean, why only machines? I mean, you will look at me, you will cry, you will laugh, but how do I know that you're conscious, right? I'm sort of being very polite in extending this convention. I'm assuming that you are conscious. That's the argument that he made. Of course, people have argued against this position also. So the point here is that there could be this fight between two people, right? That I'm conscious and I can think, and I think that you are not conscious. And the same thing can be told from the other person's point of view. And this could actually lead to solipsism, right? The solipsism is this notion that what exists is just my mind, contents of my mind, right? And everything else is not necessarily conscious. Okay, so yeah, so let me sort of take a pause here and then just give you brief definitions of AI. So I just wanted to introduce you to the Turing test. very briefly, I'll introduce AI because I'm sure that the other speakers will go into much more detailed discussion of the technological aspects of AI. But very quickly, that we can sort of argue that AI has 3 levels, you can say: narrow intelligence, artificial narrow intelligence, artificial general intelligence, and artificial super intelligence. Now, narrow intelligence is where you have the ability of the machine or the computer program to accomplish a narrow set of tasks. For example, to play chess or to compute, do mathematical computations, for example. Whereas general intelligence is something where we can do a whole broad spectrum of things, and there should be learning. There should be it could be able to understand to some extent people's emotions, thoughts, interact socially, be self-aware. That's where we stand. I mean, right? We can do a whole bunch of things. We're not good at playing chess particularly, but we could do many other things, which probably a computer which can play chess may not be able to do. And of course, super intelligence is something which greatly exceeds the cognitive performance of humans in virtually all domains of interest, which we can be very sure that we have no evidence that something like that exists today. Now, what is very important to remember is that very loosely speaking, right, the artificial narrow intelligence is based upon, you can say, the structure of the human brain. Very vaguely and very loosely, I should say. The reason being that if you compare, if you look at the brain itself, right, I mean, it is of extraordinary complexity. So much so that you can actually compare the brain to the universe itself, at least to the Milky Way galaxy, because the brain has roughly around 86 billion neurons and 100 trillion synapses, much more than the number of these synapses are connections between the neurons. These connections, the number are much more than the number of stars in the Milky Way galaxy. And it's not just that this comparison is just about complexity. It's also about the way the brain functions or the way the brain has evolved. There is the argument that the structure of the universe and the laws that govern it is more similar probably than the structure and growth of the human brain. There's lots of this, it's called network cosmology, this field which studies the evolution of the universe and the laws that govern it. And they find that similar laws probably hold for the growth and the evolution of the brain itself. Now, I thought I should show you this picture because it's a fascinating picture. It came in New York Times in 2006. There are 2 pictures here. One on the left side is the picture of neurons in the brain of a mouse. Okay, neurons in the brain of a mouse. There are 3 neurons. You can see that there are 3 neurons. The one in yellow here, if I can mark it, the one here, and this red ones here, these 2. So there are 3 neurons here, and you can see all these connections here, rich connections. And remember, this picture is very tiny things. These are all micrometers. And what you see on the right-hand side is billions of light years. This is actually a simulation of the way the galaxy, the way the universe actually looks like at the largest scales. So these are all clusters of galaxies. Dark matter, stars, heavenly bodies, etc. And look at the 2 pictures. It looks very similar. And remember, the similarity is not just visual. It's not just a photoshopping. It's not just about photoshopping, but one can argue that there is laws that govern the behavior of the universe and the laws that govern the structure of the nervous system, the growth of the nervous system. There's a lot of similarity between them. It's not just about the visual convergence. I thought this is very nice to put it out here. Now, coming back to the brain itself, right? Now, the brain is an ultimate machine, and there are several arguments. It's highly complex. It's very robust to noise. It can operate under extreme amounts of noise, and a whole bunch of things. For example, it can operate under very less power, 12.6 watts, probably much lower than the bulb that we use in our homes, right? How does it work? Unfortunately, we really don't know how it works. That's the you can say it's a sad thing, but it's also a good thing, right? Because that gives us scope to study it. And this is not something that I am saying it. There's a statement by the famous neuroscientist V.S. Ramachandran. He argues that the brain cells is still at a Faraday stage. Now, Faraday stage is basically a stage where the science is not fully mature enough. This is going back to Michael Faraday, who discovered electromagnetism. But the theory of electromagnetism came much later because of the work of Maxwell. So argument is that the brain cells is still at a very nascent stage. We really don't understand how the brain works, but we have some idea by looking at its operation and the structure and function, but we really have no, you can say, unified understanding of the laws that govern the brain itself. Again, another list here comparing the computer to the brain. I'm not going to go through all the list, but I just mentioned in the yellow here, the ones marked in yellow are the places where we don't really do well. Okay, remaining we are actually better than the brain, because we have more components than we have more components in the computer. and we are massively parallel. Our brains are massively parallel, and we have high resistance to noise and interference. The only place where we fall short is in terms of computations per second and in terms of precision. Those are the two places where we fall short of the computer. Otherwise, our brains are much more powerful, you know. And I think this is something that we should tell people who are depressed, you know. We should tell them more often, because you know, we are so precious. I think this is very important, very positive message, right? That we really we are carrying in our skulls this amazing object, which is so powerful, and we don't even know it, you know. Okay, so limitations of today's AI, a whole bunch of limitations. It's nowhere near to the human brain, as I already mentioned to you. It can't learn from few examples, okay? Whereas even a child can learn from very few examples, you know, whereas the AI today requires typically enormous amount of data to be trained, you know. And we also don't know why many of these AI algorithms work actually. Just like how we don't know how the brain works, you can argue that many of these algorithms of AI also, we really don't know how it works. We have some idea, but not really how it works. Of course, this is something which is major problem, right? It's unable to feel emotions, compassion, ethics, values, sense of fairness. I mean, all these things are alien to AI. It has absolutely no idea. Challenges of AI, I'm not going to go into very great detail here because I think other speakers will talk about it. This whole problem of abuse of AI, deep fakes, fake news, creating lethal machines, you know, weapons. Same thing about, you can argue that a lot of argument can be made about it can take away jobs. Of course, the notion of doomsday scenario, that at some point in time, these AI machines can take over the world and stuff like that. Notion of technological singularity, you know, explosion of intelligence, which can lead to unforeseen consequences and stuff like that. So one question that is very important to ask would be, will intelligent machines coexist with us? Will it control us or will it replace us? I mean, there's something that we really need to understand. And there is opinion which is divided, you know, there is no consensus in how we can answer this question. What will happen if the goals of AI is not aligned with ours, right? That's another thing. And AI ethics is very problematic. I'll mention that very briefly. Now, if you look at the biggest problems of humanity, right, one can argue that there are very huge problems, right, about wars, conflicts, suffering, poverty, of course, right, hunger, terrorism, pandemic, all kinds of things are there. Now, what Max Tegmark, who is actually a very famous physicist, argues that that true. I mean, we don't disagree that all this is very problematic to humanity, but also along with this list, we need to argue that one of the most important problems and important topic of debate is what about the future of life with AI. Along with this list, we have to add it, you know, we can't ignore it anymore, right? And it is important, just like climate change and other things are important. We also have to ask this question and debate. And I think that's the reason this workshop is also going to throw up these questions here. What is the future going to be, future of life with AI? AI and the ethics, as I said, you know, very huge, very problematic. I think there's a huge scope of research here for the humanities, social sciences, philosophy, definitely. How to define ethics? Are there universals that, how do we even define these universals? We know experientially what truth, beauty, love, goodness is, but how do we even formulate them? What's the framework? And I think this is where philosophy can really play a very big role. And this is very important for AI, you know, because how do we define ethics for AI research, both for AI research and for AI functioning and AI in society, for example. Yeah, so that's the point. So the point that I want to just make here is that there's a need for philosophy, religion, science, psychology, neuroscience, cultural studies, art, right? Art, engineering and technology, of course. And all of them had to come together to answer this problem. It's no longer a single discipline. It's multidisciplinary, transdisciplinary field. And that's actually a very good thing today, right? That we have to engage in these discussions and debates. And of course, the long-term goal should be about empathy and compassion. And the short-term goal is, of course, AI safety research. And maybe in the discussion phase, we can elaborate on these. Okay. Yeah, so basically, I'm just mentioning that there's no universal consensus on ethics. There is contradictions and paradoxes. It's very difficult to list out rules for AI, you know. Do this, don't do this. Very difficult. You can't just say, thou shall not kill. I mean, you can't put such a rule. What if there is a hostage situation and a person is keeping 100 people in hostage? The AI might have to kill that person who's holding a hostage, right? So you can't have these universal rules, no? And the source of ethics should be rooted in experience of well-being, is definitely true. And this is where actually consciousness comes in, is what I feel that consciousness should play a very big role here. So I thought I'll just put this, I'll be very bold enough to do this, be very sort of bold enough to say that the three open problems I would say are ABC. It's convenient that it's ABC. C is consciousness. What is consciousness? B, how does the brain work? And can AI be conscious? So I would argue that these are the ABC of three open big problems. And this is the biggest puzzle for the century. And maybe we can add D and E to it also. I'll tell you what D and E are. D and E is going to be how do you deal with ego, right? So, I mean, we should not forget that, right? So I would argue that these are probably the 5 big problems that we have to work on. Definitely, these are the 5 big problems: AI, brain, consciousness, and dealing with ego. Now, what is consciousness? I think very briefly, I think, we can argue that it's about experience, right? Right now, for example, you're hearing my words. You're probably having a visual perception. You're having an auditory perception. You have thoughts. You might be hungry. You might be sad. You might be very happy. You might be bored. So there is all these things. But the question is, this is what's called the hard problem of consciousness, is that why do we even have this experience, subjective experience, right? It could just all be just mechanical, and we could just have some brain firing, and there may not be any experience associated with that. So why do we even have subjective experience? So there's a need for science of consciousness. So we need to be able to come up with a scientific framework if we can measure it. We don't even know whether we can, but it's going to be very important, right? Because we can ask this question that a person in coma, right? Does he or she experience pain? We need to know that, right? Then the questions of euthanasia and all kinds of stuff can be asked. Should we pull the plug, or do we, maybe the person feels pain, we don't know. And of course, in AI, it's very important, right? That if you are able to come up with the science of consciousness, will robots ever become conscious? That's the very big question that we should ask. We don't know how to answer it. But can robots, if they can ever feel pain, can it taste tea? Can she or he love or hate? Can AI get bored? These kind of questions. So consciousness as such is very rich. I just said earlier that just like AI too, there's no single discipline which can answer the question. Ranging from brain science to physics to neuroscience to computer science, information theory, all kinds of things. It's a huge discipline. And there are a whole bunch of theories. I'm not going to go into any details about this. This is just a short listing. There's much more of them. Many theories of consciousness. But also what I want to mention to you is that it's not just the science which is important. What is also important is a metaphysical framework in order to interpret these theories. That is very important. And the role of philosophy is as important as science. I'll just give you an example. I'll just give you 2 models. I would just call it as Model M and Model C. Model M is the materialistic framework that we are all familiar with. There is a world of matter out there. Inside the material world are these bodies, you, me, and others. And inside the body is the mind, and inside the mind is I, right? Which is consciousness, if at all, There's one way of looking at the metaphysical framework. You could also have a model. This is one model, and this is probably the most popular model today. But you could also have a model which is totally ulta, completely reversed. I call the Model C, consciousness-centric model. So you have universal consciousness, which we don't know what it is. We experience it, but we don't know. We can't define it. We call it the universal consciousness. And inside the universal consciousness, there are these minds which are popping in. Inside the mind, there is 2 portions. There's a private part of the mind. There's a public part of the mind. The private part of the mind is thoughts, feelings, sensations, and perceptions. And there's the public part of the mind is where the body is. And the body and the world are this intersection of this public part of the mind. I'm just giving an example. I'm not saying that I'm not saying which model is correct. I'm just giving an alternative to the materialistic framework. And there could be more other such models. These are not the only 2 models. But, so you notice that this is very important to see this distinction. And I thought I'll just give you this interesting thought experiment. Now, which model you might subscribe to? The story of this very nice story of, it's again a thought experiment by Frank Jackson in 1982. Talked about this, Mary is a girl who's brought up in this room. It's a black and white room. And right from childhood, she's been brought up and she has no experience of color whatsoever. And her parents are physicists and neuroscientists, they've taught her everything about color. They've taught her about color, vision, the visual cortex, etc., okay? She's living, and one fine day, she steps out of the room and she sees a rose, a red rose. Now the question is, does she experience anything new? She knows everything about optics, about light, about color, about the psychophysics of color. The question is, does she does she learn anything new? And this is actually, and there are 2 camps here. One would argue, no, she did not learn anything new. And one would argue that, yes, she did learn something new. Now, if you believe that there is something new that she learned, then you sort of refute physicalism. You don't believe in physicalism. There's something non-physical about it. Anyway, I mean, there's more that we could talk about it later, maybe. I'll move on. And this particular view is, there's a very nice paper in Nature, one of the topmost journals you can ever find, Nature journal. There's this article by a physicist and professor of physics and astronomy, Richard Conn Henry. He argues it's a very short paper, you could read it up. He argues that quantum mechanics has taught us that, and other aspects in physics, has taught us that the universe is entirely immaterial. It is entirely mental, and he uses the word spiritual as well in this particular paper in Nature. And he says that the only reality is mind and observations, and but they're not material, they're not physical. Okay. Now I think very quickly, I think I'm running out of time. I'll try and see if I can. Yeah. So what links AI, brain, and consciousness? Is there something that can link all the three? One strand is causality. One of them is no, causality is not correlation, right? For example, let's say that you look at the sale of fans and consumption of ice creams. Both of them are correlated in summer, right? They both are in high demand in summer, but then there's no causation between them. There's only a correlation, and the causation is actually the temperature, the temperature in that particular region, right? So this causality, and there is this very fundamental work by a few decades of work actually, by Julia Pearl, Israeli computer scientist, who talks about this ladder of causation. I sort of urge you to read this book, the Book of Why, and he argues that the current AI today that we have is all dumb. It's all dumb, and we need this notion of causal reasoning and causal inference. And it very beautifully argues in this book, the Book of Why. I'll just mention that I thought. Now, causality also is another link between consciousness and brain. Recall what I told you about ABC, right? AI, brain, consciousness. So causality, I already showed you by this slide that it's trying to link between, definitely for AI, but also causality could be a link between brain and consciousness. There's lots of studies which talk about causal activity in brain, and how that is related to consciousness. So that could be another thing. So the point I wanted to mention is that this is a great opportunity for research, that causality-based measures of consciousness. There's a huge amount of work that could be done. Causal machine learning is probably the next big thing in AI. So the causal revolution is on. So we had information revolution, thanks to Shannon and Turing and all these people. There was the information revolution, which is still on, but now we have the causal revolution, and probably causality is one important. It's not the only thing, but that's definitely one thing which will probably link consciousness, AI, and the brain. Okay, I'm nearly towards the end of my talk now. I thought I like to put up the slide. It's actually a list comparing minds and machines. It's not an exhaustive list. It's trying to compare minds and machines in a rough manner. Minds are conscious, definitely. That's the definition of a mind. Machines, we don't know. The jury is out there. Minds definitely are self-aware, possibly. Maybe you could argue that non-human minds or animal minds are not self-aware. We don't know. Machines, I think, probably no is the answer. Of course, minds are embodied, or there is some relation between mind and body. Again, that's another thing which we know for sure. There's a correlation between, for example, brain activity and experience. Nobody can refute that, but we don't know which is more fundamental, right? Model M or model C, right? We don't know. Of course, machines have a body too. Again, the brain part, the machines have programs, algorithms, software. Minds interact with the world and with other minds. Machines also are networked. Cognition and language are fundamental for minds to interact. And machines have a hierarchy of languages, from hardware assembly level language to higher languages, right? Causal understanding, as I told you, that's very important. There is a cause-effect relationship which the human mind definitely, and even animal minds, they know what causes what. I mean, they have a model of causal inference. Machines, I don't think so. One could argue that there may be some amount of causal reasoning, but not really too much. Learning through experience. Machines, they claim that ANN, ML, DL, deep learning, machine learning are also doing the same thing. Emotions and feelings, clearly machines, no, I would say. Ethics, morality, I shouldn't put a question mark, I should have said no there. Belief, faith, religion, culture, machines probably have somewhat very poor version of it, very poor mimic of them, axioms, models, doctrines, very poor mimic of that. Life goals, machines can be self-programmed, probably, I don't know. Okay, the last one I think is very important. It's about the journey of the self, right? I mean, I think that this is probably true for, at least definitely for us Indians. We believe that the goal is to go from the self to the no self and to the universal self. I mean, that's, at least it's rooted in our culture, that in fact we like people who are less egoistic, right? What do we mean by that? less egoistic, that means that person is more inclusive, right? The person, or he or she, does not have the limited sense of the self. Whereas in the machines, it's just the opposite, right? We want the machines to be more and more having a self, right? So that it can empathize with us. So that seems to be the thing. And this is something that we are obsessed with, the doomsday scenario in Hollywood, Bollywood, definitely in the Hollywood movies. But I thought I'll just end with this very fascinating story that I want to end with. And this is my last set of slides. The story of the 3 robots of Sambara in the Yoga Vashishta. Now, Sambara was an Asura. Now, Yoga Vashishta is a very beautiful a text, 6th or 7th century AD, attributed to sage Valmiki. And in this particular story, Sambara is a demon who has actually created a parallel heaven, a parallel universe actually, with cities and beings and forests and all that. But and he's very, very powerful. And Sambara actually is always at war with the Devas. That's always the case, right? The Asuras and Devas. And Sambara, what he does is he creates 3 demons, 3 actually projections, robot projections, called Dama, Vyala, and Kata. Now, these 3 robots, they don't have any inner experience. These robots are completely zombies. They have no experience. And they're very, very powerful robots, and they defeat the Asuras every time. So they all go to Brahma. That's what they do, right? The Devas go to Brahma and they complain. How do we defeat these 3 demons? Now, Brahma tells them, look, these demons are very powerful and they're able to defeat you because they don't have the sense of I. They don't have a sense of self. And that's the reason that they don't have any ego. They don't have any psychological conditioning. They don't have fear. They don't have desire. And so Brahma tells them that that's the reason that they're so powerful. So the trick is try to make them get that ego, somehow. And so the Devas have this strategy where they try and debate. They try and what they do is, like, for example, they retreat from the battle, and they try to create pride and fear and psychological conditioning in the 3 demons, and they succeed in doing that. And once the 3 demons have the sense of self, they get defeated and they get destroyed, and eventually Sambara also gets destroyed. So this is very, very interesting. And so the question is, should AI robots be endowed with notions of I and mind? That's the question to ask. And I'm sure that there are lots of ways to answer this, and there's obviously no consensus on this. So let me conclude by just thanking a few people here. So definitely Professor Sangeeta for the entire idea of having this workshop. The genesis of the idea was her, and I think it was an excellent idea because it gives us this platform to debate and discuss. Niharika was completely instrumental in handling the entire logistics of the workshop. Harikrishnan and Aditi are my students who helped me with some of the slides in what you see here. Ashwini and Abhishek, again, I would thank them, because of whom it's possible to have this online. And without the financial support of Tata Trust and DST Government of India, we could not have done much of the research that we're doing in NIAS. So I'm going to end with this, and thank you very much. I know I'm a little over time, but I hope we'll have enough time for discussion now. So thank you very much, and we can take questions now. Thank you. Yeah.
I request everyone to write their questions in the chat box. Mithun sir will be able to respond to them. Or sir, do you want the participants to raise their hands and speak? Or is it better on the chat box?
I think
maybe Niharika, some of the questions I think have been already in the chat box.
Yes, ma'am.
Maybe you can start with raising 1 or 2, and then that the others would read, so that we can have the discussion started. And
Yes,
perhaps we would also request Dr. Robert to say a few words. Professor Nitin, if I have your permission.
Oh, yeah, I very much so. Please, yeah, I'm interested in listening to him and his comments and his questions. Yeah.
So, sir, the first question is, are emotions not a consequence of socialization? It seems convincible that standalone intelligence is purely algorithmic. Would like to hear speaker's view.
Okay.
Are emotions not a consequence of socialization?
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, so one could argue that, like, if you network machines, right? I mean, in the future, just think in terms of science fiction for the time being, maybe they could have their own socialization, right? Like, they could be networked and they will have their own socialization, which will be different from ours, obviously. But it's conceivable that they might have their own socialization, and because of which they might have emotions. I know it's far-fetched today, but think about it, right? 100 years back, you would not have imagined that we could communicate the way we are doing, right? or kind of we have self-driving cars, and so I don't know whether machines could also do that. That is, they could socialize amongst themselves through networked, when they're connected to each other, and based on that they evolve and have their own culture or emotions. I think it's conceivable, it's possible. It's just that it'll be very different from the way we function. It may not have the same emotions, it's probably going to be very, very different. I mean, that's how I would like to look at it, right? I would never say never,
There's an interesting question by Sharmishta Dhar. Even if strong AI is accepted, how can personhood questions of computers be dealt with?
Sorry, can you just, I couldn't hear the last part, Sangeeta. Sorry.
Yes, I'll read it again, Professor Nitin. Even if strong AI is accepted, how can personhood questions of computers be dealt with? So I didn't understand quite follow. Is Sharmishta Dhar here? Maybe you can clarify what you meant by that question?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Where are you?
Ma'am. Yes, can you? Yes.
Please go ahead. Yeah.
I think I asked this question having in mind this particular conception of personhood, that being a person, I think, necessarily involves being in a certain state, having a certain subjective qualia, apart from having memory, capacity for planning and self-awareness. So can these states like memory and planning and a certain kind of attachment to the things that we have in the world be ascribed to machines?
Okay.
Even if strong AI is accepted?
Yeah, I think if you accept strong AI, then I think, but that's the whole debate, right? That strong AI itself may not be true, right? May not be possible, right? So that, I think, is the problem, is what I feel, right? That if you accept that there is real intelligence and it's not just a simulation of intelligence, and if you argue that real intelligence implies understanding and it implies consciousness in some form, right? Then I think if you accept strong AI, then I don't know how to avoid, how would you sort of then avoid these questions of self-reflection and, the personhood in some sense. So I think to accept strong AI, I would imagine that you have to take in the whole thing. You have to take in the personhood, the sense of ego, the sense of the self, if you accept strong AI. But if you don't accept strong AI, then there's no problem at all. But again, I'm just basing this argument on the conclusion, on the point that strong AI implies understanding. It implies conscious experience, and you when you say I understand, that you understand, right? And it's not just that you understand, but I'm aware that I understand, right? So that I don't know whether I've answered your question, but that's how I would look at it, right? So
one of the questions is, can machines be seen as another being in the universe?
Yeah, so when you say another being, do you mean sort of having an identity, having a self-awareness or self-reflection or something like that? Or because you have to define being, right? That's the, again, we get into these philosophical problems, which are, I think, good questions to ask, So like, for example, the Sophia, right? In some sense, we're treating Sophia like a being, right? Because, it's been granted citizenship, right? So, that means it's actually a being, right? It's an independent being. So, but then one might argue that doesn't make sense at all. I think you could argue both ways. It again hinges on the notion of self, I think.
Yeah. Hi. Manas is here. The person who asked the question.
Oh, please go ahead. Yeah.
So the question is exactly that. When we sort of acknowledge that there are deformities or maybe the lack of abilities that can be considered as being in general in our universe, what would be the deciding factor for a machine to be qualified as a being as per the research consciousness?
I think so. Right now, the stage where we are in terms of consciousness research, I don't think we have reached a consensus as to what is the threshold. I think I would probably argue that you need some notion of self-awareness, probably. But okay, maybe not also, because animals, right? One could argue that animals are aware, but they're not aware that they're aware. Right? They're aware, but they're not aware that they're aware. So maybe you don't even need self-reflection. Maybe you can put the bar lower than that, but then you would need awareness for sure. That means you would need the sense of having an experience, right? It's not just a zombie. It's not just some transistors firing, but having an experience, having a qualia, right? And the problem is always, how do you know that it's having an experience? How do you from outside know that it's having an experience? So that problem is always there, Manas. So I mean, I'm not qualified to answer the question, because maybe Sangeeta can also throw light on this. Yeah, please go ahead, Sangeeta. Yeah.
Ma'am wants to say a few words. Yes.
Primarily, Manasji, may I know your background, please?
Sorry,
What's your
background?
disciplinary background? What's your disciplinary background?
Oh, ma'am, I'm an electronics engineer.
Okay, all right.
I worked in semiconductor industry, and I've been working independently.
Thank you. See, in philosophy and also in general interdisciplinary work, we have something called epistemology. Epistemology begins with clarifying and contextualizing the basic ideas which we use to elaborate a particular position. So in your question, I think there are many people who would have the same question which you are raised. I think it's very important that when we use a particular word, that it has to be defined at least minimalistically. For example, being is a word, is almost like a jargon or a technical word, both in Eastern philosophy and Western philosophy. There are books which have started with the word being, for example, being and time. So there are lots of, many philosophers who have talked about it in great detail. So is computer or is machine another being in the universe? I think each of those words have to be analyzed. And in the process of analysis, we will get perhaps a very near to the final answer. Still, we may not have the answer, but at least we will understand that question better. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Can I go ahead with the next question?
Please go ahead. Yeah.
How much time we have, Niharika ji?
Ma'am, till 45.
Okay.
We have a few minutes more.
Yeah.
Some more questions, sir. Can you please share the list of theories of AI?
Theories of AI. Okay, so I mean that's okay. When you say theory of AI, right? I'll give you. Okay, so like for example, deep learning. Let's say deep learning. There are a few theories which tries to explain deep learning. Like there's something called the information bottleneck theory. There are a few more theories. I don't remember the names now. So I don't think there is an overarching theory of AI as such. At least not that I'm aware of. Maybe somebody in the audience who is more well-versed than me can answer this, but there are theories for deep learning, for example. Then there's MI algorithms, which have their own mathematical foundations, but there's no single theory of AI as such.
So there are two questions that I can see on consciousness. How can we help students and professionals in helping choose best career options by using consciousness and AI? And another question on consciousness is, can consciousness be enhanced? Is there a way to measure it?
Okay. Yeah, very, very good questions. I think for the first question, I think maybe we should advertise our NIAS CSP program. I would encourage this person to look at our website, because we have courses, we have internships, we have PhD program, and one could apply. I'm not saying that we're the only people doing it, but I mean, from our point of view, I mean, we would definitely encourage people to go to our website and see the kind of activities that we do, and you will get some idea. Of course, there are other centers around the world as well. So I think there is lots of scope for working in consciousness research and with interface with AI. So, and we could provide you with more information if you can send us an email. We'll be happy to do that. For the second question, okay, there are two parts here. One is measuring and one is enhancing. And they're related in some sense. Now, if you look at the scientific theories of consciousness, right? Right now, as of today, there is no universally accepted measuring device for consciousness. Like, for example, let's say I want to measure temperature. I have a thermometer. To measure pressure, I have a barometer, right? I have a standardized unit also for temperatures and pressures. But we don't have anything like that even remotely for consciousness. We don't have a consciousness meter as yet. And we don't even know whether we can have it, because some people argue that philosophically, it does not make sense. It's a quality and you can't measure it using a quantity, But maybe there could be some proxies for the quality, maybe some correlations with the body or brain states. And there are certain theories which try to measure those things actually. But to claim that they measure consciousness would be too much to claim. They probably measure some correlations with experience, you know. So yeah, that's the measurement part. And enhancement, of course, we don't know what we mean by that. Maybe you could argue that can we enhance our sense of self or well-being, or, you know, and I'm sure that's very much possible, right? There are methods, there are traditions, you know, and maybe Sangeeta, do you want to add anything?
Well, I think we can also take another question in this context of what you're discussing, Nitin.
Sure. Yeah.
So that question is from Deepa Singh.
Okay.
Is Deepa Singh here?
Yes, ma'am. I'm here.
Yeah. Okay. Can we see you? I hope you are not a machine.
Yes, ma'am. Of course.
Yeah. So we are to see you. Are you here?
Yes, ma'am. I'm here. I was just on the move.
Niharika, can you find where she is?
Yeah.
I'm not able
Yes, ma'am.
Ah,
She's
okay.
here.
Yes, ma'am.
Yes. Hi.
Hi.
So, would you like to raise your question first, and then maybe we can respond?
Right, ma'am. So, ma'am, we see and sir, we see a very heavy anthropocentric bias when we discuss or talk about machine intelligence. And this is the question that I raised, that questions like personhood, consciousness, or expectation from an artificial intelligence to be generally intelligent in all fields of human endeavors only, human endeavors, so to speak of, is a very heavy anthropocentric bias. And it is the way that we are approaching the evolving AI tech. This is the, the heavy narrative. And this is the global, currently global narrative, dominant narrative. So do you think it can be harmful? Do you think this sort of already inbuilt bias, anthropocentric bias in our narrative, the way we are pushing AI tech, can be harmful for our future or for the development of the technology per se?
Yeah, perhaps Professor Nitin would have an answer, but then let me steal some time from him before he would respond to this idea which you have shared. I think definitely there is anthropocentrism is there in first of all in conceiving an idea called machine, and then endowing the machine with human-like qualities, and finally to also imagine that the machine would have a self like the humans. But what is interesting in all this, I think there is also a hegemony which is working, which is to say that the human versus the machine. So either the machines are superior to the humans, and or the humans are superior to machines. So to add to your sentiment and thought, I think it is not only the anthropomorphizing of the qualities, but also there is a politicization of emotions and the self, which we will see. And I think this is something which belongs completely to the social science and humanities to examine. But I think it's extremely important that when we discuss about AI in this context, it's very important to remember what you have just said, so that we can distance from ourselves and see if there's any other possibility. Now, the question would be, how else can we imagine? If we are talking about the machine, how else can we imagine? Is there any other way of conceiving and imagining an alien entity called the machine?
Exactly,
so how do we relate? So another question is, maybe we can even relate with the machine only if the machine would have human-like qualities. Otherwise, how can I relate with an alien entity without knowing what that entity is capable of? So I guess the positing of the human-like qualities is something which we do also perhaps to start an engagement with the machine. So, but I think what you said is very valid. Yes.
Thank you, ma'am.
Yeah, can I just also add to that? Yeah, I agree with you, Sangeeta, and this is a very important thing to further explore. But there are also, I would say, aspects of AI, which, for example, let's say drones, right? So they are trying to mimic flight. Now, of course, human beings, we don't fly, right? But bats and butterflies and, you know, birds, they fly. So, I mean, the idea is also a huge, there's a lot of field of work trying to mimic other kinds of functions, you know, and in the AI thing also. But I get the point that what she's trying to say, and that we should not just be focused on human-centric Yeah, that
Yes,
is
sir.
point
So
well taken.
maybe to add an addendum to what you were saying, could we perhaps look into different ideas of consciousness or personhood? Is it possible?
Definitely,
Rather than from a
and
human perspective, maybe from a machine perspective, maybe from another perspective altogether.
yeah,
Because
absolutely. I mean,
yeah.
that is the goal of consciousness research, right? That we don't want to limit ourselves to one view. We need to look at it from various facets, various angles. Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Great to know. Thank you, sir.
I think
Thank you.
I see a tongue-in-cheek question from Jamiel Ahmed from Kashmir. Is Jamiel here? Jamiel, Dr.
Yes.
Jamiel, is he here? Let me read out his question and perhaps, can we expect artificial intelligence giving us philosophical texts or other literary texts, and then a simple hardware or software crisis turning to end that artificial intelligence philosophy? If did we miss anything from this question, Dr. Jamiel? You can add to it. Dr. Jamiel?
Oh,
Dr. Jamiel, you are here. He's
his
here.
bandwidth is low.
Oh, okay.
Ma'am, I'm not like he's here, but I think his bandwidth is low.
Okay.
It's not loading it to him.
Mhm. All right. Well, that's a very interesting point of view. If he was here, he could have did something.
Yeah, I mean, you want to take a shot, Sanita? Do you want me to say something?
No, I was thinking whether he would like to add something
sure.
to what he said, what he meant by literary texts, and if he had a. Dr. Jamil, can you hear us? If you can hear us, maybe you can just switch off your video and just use your microphone. Or first of all, you have to unmute yourself.
Yeah, hello.
Yeah.
Yes, we can hear you now.
Yeah, am I audible?
Yes,
you
please.
are.
Yeah, I am very happy. Good evening to all of you. And thanks for this wonderful lecture, sir.
Thank you.
Basically, sir, what my question is that if we have artificial intelligence developing nowadays, and someday we have artificial intelligence, will it be giving us some texts of philosophy or some literary texts or create a canon of its own? And then with a mere crisis of a software or hardware, that artificial intelligence and that philosophy which is based on artificial intelligence will just be reverted back to its fakeness and fake nature.
Okay. One sort of attempt to answer this question is I mentioned about the ladder of causation, right? So what Judea is saying is that the third ladder of causation is about imagination, about reasoning, about creativity and all that. So we are nowhere even close to the third stage. We're at the first stage about correlations and pattern matching and, at best, the third. So what you're saying is about like imagination and, being able to do these thought experiments and then, philosophical reasoning. So right now we are nowhere near to that in terms of AI. But one would argue that we try to simulate some of it. Like there are these clever algorithms which try to create poetry, random poetry. But I don't think anybody will believe that it can understand that what it has spit out, like this haikus and koans, which are short poetry. And but I don't think anybody believes that the computer program actually understands that poetry, So I don't think we are anywhere close to that. But so I don't. It's very hard to answer that question, because will it ever happen?
Yeah, I had heard about some technology called psychological writing or psycho writing, wherein some transmitters are fitted to the mind of a person, to the brain of a person, and then what is in the brain of that very person is taken by that machine outside and transcribed into words or in some sort of language. And we have a text which is a combination of both the human brain and of that very machine, which is just put into that process of taking that information from that human mind to out.
Right. Yeah, augmented intelligence. Yeah, there are all these ideas are there, but I don't think there's anywhere close to imagination, which I think philosophy requires imagination quite a bit, right? I mean, that probably the heart of philosophy is imagination, right? So
yeah.
There's another very interesting comment or a question from Shashi Kumar.
Okay.
What he has written is humans have both strengths and weakness, which enables various aspects of human experience. Is AI is meant only to be for best outcomes?
Yeah, Yeah, I mean, I guess the goal is that that we want to remove all the flaws of humanity and then build. But probably it's too deluded goal, you know, that we want to have only the good things and not the. I mean, probably that's the goal, right? Like when you build a self-driving car, I mean, you don't want to have any accidents, right? But we humans, we make accidents all the time. I mean, a lot of people die of accidents every day, but we don't want that in the machine. I think that's the goal that we have, definitely, right? It's a very utilitarian view.
So that, ma'am, can I
Yes,
go
yes.
forward with the question?
Yes.
Yeah, there's a question. How does the notion of causality actually help us understand the problem with consciousness?
Okay. Yeah, very, very good question, actually. So one thing is that, as I mentioned to you very briefly in my talk, there are several scientific theories of consciousness, several of them. There are a few of them which are based upon the notion that consciousness is linked in some way to causal activity. It could be causal activity in the brain. Now, this would be the neuroscientific approach. Now, interestingly, if you look at our ancient systems, right, even very sophisticated philosophical system like the Kashmir Shaivism, there also they talk about Kriya Shakti, you know, for example, that is, and people have tried to link it with causality, you know, that subjective experience in the Kashmir Shaivism model of consciousness, it's linked to having this ability to have a causal influence on the world, you know. So there are several philosophical systems, both I would say in the neuroscientific literature and in other traditions in the world, which try to link causal power, the causal power of ability to causally influence something, you know, to consciousness, to subjectivity. So there are these things, and I would be happy to share some of the material that we have, that we know of. So there is several interesting ideas that one could work on. Yeah.
There are two questions that can be related. One is from, I think, Dr. Pushya Srinivas. Can AI replace doctors in future? And the other one is by Supriya Bajpai. She says, can we say that machines are deterministic in nature?
Okay, I'll answer the second question first. Deterministic, no. The short answer is no, because you could have randomness, you could have quantum phenomena in the machine itself. So you could remove determinism from the machine. That is not a problem. It's already been done, you know. So we could bring in some stochasticity, some noise, some randomness. So they need not be deterministic. And they also learn and adapt. Coming to the first question, I think the goal should never be to replace doctors, because it should be to aid doctors. That's why it's called computer aided diagnosis or computer assisted surgery, for example. But in the future, it's an interesting question. Like, would they completely replace doctors? I don't think so, and I hope not. I mean, I don't think we should even go along the direction. I think there should always be. It should be a combination. It should be that together we can do more than just the doctor or the machine. You know. So I think that should be our goal, at least, you know. So
Rishabh Samra has a question. I think we can take up.
Do we have time to take more questions?
Actually, we need to start the second session also at 6.
At 6 o'clock, right? So yeah.
Yes.
I was just wondering if Robert Garasi would like to say something now,
Yes.
or maybe he would like to stay later tomorrow, or we leave it to you. But since we see your presence here, and he has multiple number of books bringing in humanities into the context of AI, very fascinating author from New York.
Hi everyone, thank you. I didn't expect to have anything to say, but thank you so much, Professor Nagaraj, for that wonderful talk. Actually, I thought it was very stimulating. There were lots of interesting insights there.
Thank you.
What really stood out for me it was two things. One had to do with the question of mimicry and the Turing test that you discussed, and in the question and answer, it kind of came up in a number of different ways. And you know, we as a human species have a tendency to not consider some people as people, and that always leads to tragedy. There are never good outcomes to that, and so ultimately, I think at some point it becomes, if the machine can mimic if we get to the point where a machine can mimic human beings, you can call it mimicry, but if it walks like a duck, talks like a duck, and swims like a duck, it's a duck, right? And if we get a machine that can tell us it has whatever constitutes emotions for it for all intents and purposes appears conscious, who are we to tell it it's not, right? And that'll raise huge, debates in terms of how we'll figure out things like legal rights. I mean, everybody knows the Sophia question is just kind of silly. It's not really a citizen.
Yeah.
It has no real rights. But someday that might be a real thing. And I think it goes right back to what you were trying to argue, early on. And that we'll really have to reflect very seriously on how to be inclusive and be thoughtful. I think that really emerges very nicely from what you had to say. The one big question I had for you has to do with adjudication of priorities, right? Like if we bring together humanities people, social sciences people, scientists, and we give them all a say on how we're developing our technologies. And I agree with you that that's a conversation we need to have. But we all get locked into our disciplinary expectations and we think that our perspectives tend to be the right perspectives. How do you see a conversation happening among people from various disciplines, and especially when it comes to something like a policy decision, right? If a government has to make a decision about what kind of technology it wants to enable or advance or fund, and there's dispute among the different disciplines, how do you see that conversation moving forward? Because I think that's going to be critical.
Thank you, Robert, I think for your comments. And this is a very, very nice question. So my immediate answer is, it may appear strange. I probably would look at it like an interfaith dialogue. If you remember, right? Like we have this interfaith between religions, right? We have interfaith congregations and conferences. Because the problem is exactly the same even there, because each religion or each doctrine has its own absolute axioms. And the question is, how do you give or take? I get the feeling that we should have something similar. I mean, I'm just saying in that spirit that we need to have a common ground. Maybe, for example, everybody should agree that compassion is very important, for example, or well-being, and then we need to probably define it, some operational definition, and then maybe the dialogue can happen. Because otherwise, as you rightly said, we are locked into our own fields and domains, and there's no dialogue possible. There's no tolerance, right? I mean, I'm going again to the language of the interfaith thing. So we need to be tolerant. We need to be accepting others. So I think we need to start from there. We need to have this absolute ground, maybe some universals, maybe compassion, well-being. I don't know what they are, but I think we need to establish that first. And we don't have that today, right? People are talking about productivity and, but then where is compassion? So I don't know. I would imagine that we need to establish that first, and then we can have the dialogue,
That's a really interesting answer. It would be fascinating to get people who are experts in interfaith dialogue then to try to mediate those conversations. Like what are the best practices that they have developed?
Exactly. How do you mediate? Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Thank you.
Sorry about this, but we are running we have delayed our thing, and Dr. Tilak is waiting for his lecture. I'll just like to say that all your questions are noted by our team, and we'll get back to you via email regarding all your questions. Dr. Nitin will see to it that he answers, and our team will revert as soon as possible.